All right, so we are going to start talking about now specific pathogens of the central nervous system, and here we're going to focus on our Clostridium species that can affect the central nervous system. So the first one we want to talk about is tetanus. Tetanus is going to be caused by Clostridium tetani. There is a vaccine for the toxin, and this is a bacterium, so you can use antibiotics to treat. Now, the antibiotics are only going to treat for the bacteria, not the toxin. So once the toxin is made, the antibiotics are usually not going to help with the disease symptoms. So Clostridium tetani is going to be a strict anaerobe, and it's going to be a gram-positive bacterium. It has these terminal spores that it produces, and so basically the bacteria is prepared if it gets into an aerobic environment to sort of ball up into its little spore and protect itself from the oxygen. And then when it gets into an anaerobic environment, such as deep in the soil, that spore will germinate and will generate more of the bacterium. Now, it's going to have a neurogenic toxin, and that's what's going to cause the symptoms associated with Clostridium tetani. It's going to be commonly found in the soil, and it can survive there for years. So it gets into your wounds. So if you are working in the dirt and you're digging deep, you can get into exposure to the spores, and the spores can get to the wound. Clostridium tetani spores are going to be very resistant to disinfectants, as well as being able to withstand boiling, so their spores are very hardy. Now, tetanus is going to require low oxygen areas to germinate. The tetanus toxin, which is T-E-N-T, tetanus toxin, neurotoxin, is going to enter the general circulation, and it's going to find your motor neurons and sensory neurons. So it's going to be spread retroactively to the spinal cord, and then it enters your inhibitory interneurons and blocks release of glycine or GABA. Glycine and GABA are going to be important for regulation of neurotransmissions, and this is blocking them are going to cause what are called spastic paralysis. And so you're going to have spasmic contractions of muscles that usually occur locally, then extend up and down the spinal cord. Now, the toxin is going to act at the anterior horn cells in the spinal cord. That's a bad one. And this is going to block postsynaptic inhibition of the spinal motor reflexes. Now, your incubation can be between 4 days and several weeks, and the shorter the incubation period, the more severe the infection. So again, tetanus is going to work through systemically. However, there are some areas where it usually acts first. One is the master muscle of the jaw, and this is usually going to be the first affected and results in what we call lockjaw. And then you're going to have muscles for your respiratory tract as well as swallowing can be compromised. So several cases are going to suffer from severe dissemination of the toxin down the spinal cord, and this leads to this head and heels moving towards each other. Now, tetanus treatment is going to be, you're going to have a toxin antibodies, so neutralization of the toxin, with immunoglobulins transferred, so this is passive transfer. And you can also have additional supportive measures such as maintaining no stimulation, a dark, quiet environment, sedatations to make sure that people are not getting excited. And also sometimes you're going to need to provide breathing, so respirator to make sure people can breathe while the toxin is being diluted out and eventually will go away. In this time, you also want to eliminate the bacteria because you want to stop it from producing more toxin, obviously. So some of the symptoms associated with tetanus are going to be a fever, high blood pressure, muscle spasms, blocked jaw, and difficulty swallowing are all going to be those early symptoms. Now, our other Clostridium that causes infection is going to be Clostridium Botulinum. And so Clostridium Botulinum is going to be the cause of botulism. We also have a lot of people who are using Botox. And this is the toxin from botulism. So if you get too much of this toxin, it can be very deadly. Botulinum toxin is one of the most potent toxins known to man. Now, Clostridium botulinum, similar to its cousin, Clostridium tetani, are going to be gram-positive, anaerobic, spore-forming, rod-shaped. They again also have endospores that form at the end of the rods. So again, it's going to be in the soil, natural, and once it gets into an aerobic environment, those spores are going to protect the bacterium. And then when we go back into the soil in the anaerobic environment, those spores will germinate. The spores are going to contaminate food sources under anaerobic conditions, and then they can convert to a vegetated state and begin to produce their toxin. The toxin does not have smell, taste, or color, so you don't even know the toxin's in the food when you're eating it. And so this is commonly seen in home canning cases where people are canning some food and then they have improper canning techniques. They don't destroy the bacterium and then the spores, and then it's going to be able to germinate. And again, it's one of the most poisonous toxins in the world. Now, botulinum toxin, why it's so potent is because it's going to affect your motor neurons. So in the case of a muscle cell, typically you're going to have acetylcholine get released at the postsynaptic vesicles, and you're going to have a receptor for the acetylcholine on your muscle cells, and this is going to cause muscle contraction. Now, when botulinum is present, it's going to block the release of acetylcholine, and so the receptors are not engaged, and you get no contraction. And this is going to cause muscle paralysis. Now, the paralysis begins at the cranial nerve, and it develops into descending symmetrical motor paralysis, and it may involve the respiratory muscles. You have no fever or inflammation. This is simply just a toxin. There is no bacteria present usually, so there's no obvious signs of infection. And the time course of the disease progression depends on how much of the toxin a person has ingested. Now, the toxin absorbed directly through the intestinal tract will reach the neuromuscular junction via the bloodstream. And then again, it's going to prevent muscle contractions systemically. Now, the symptoms are going to depend on which nerves are damaged, of course. You can have difficulty swallowing. If you have foodborne botulism, it's going to start at about 12 hours to 36 hours. Before symptoms. And the first symptoms are usually going to be nausea, dry mouth, and sometimes diarrhea. The nervous system dysfunction is going to start later, and this is going to be blurred vision. You're going to have slurred speech, rapid eye movements. And then you're going to start with your symmetrical paralysis. This is going to start in your eyes, your ocular, your laryngeal, and then into your respiratory muscles. From there, it'll continue to spread to the trunk. The most serious complication is respiratory paralysis. And similar to your Clostridium tetani, it's a little bit opposite. So tetanus, this is death. Tetanus is associated with respiratory exhaustion. And then your botulism is associated with respiratory paralysis. So one is overstimulating, one is understimulating. There are two other forms of botulism. There's going to be infant botulism and wound botulism. So again, the symptoms of botulism are going to be constipation, poor feeding, muscle tone, lethargic, feeding problems, and can cause vision problems as well as paralysis. This is going to lead to different treatments. So one thing to keep in mind for infant botulism is going to typically occur between 3 weeks and 8 months. This is going to be a toxin being absorbed into the blood, and it's often associated with honey. Your infants are going to take in the bacteria, they're going to multiply in the large intestine, and then the toxin absorbed into the blood. The symptoms are going to, again, be for feeding, muscle tone, feeding problems, and can lead to vision problems and death. Now, mortality is less than 10%. And this is if you have proper ventilation. So supportive care is very important. And then antibiotic therapy is only given to patients with wound form to get rid of the bacterium.